Welcome back. In this fourth mini lecture on German history, I want to talk a bit more about the Second Reich. When I left you in the last lecture, Prussia, under Bismarck, had unified the German states finally into a unified state that we call Germany. Germany was forged through three limited wars with Denmark, Austria, and France. Bismarck advocated for the next 20 years a foreign policy that was very conservative, devoid of colonies, and stressed prudence, not getting overextended in terms of commitments to allies. And when we take a look at the government that the Second Reich was under. It was an authoritarian system. There was a legislature that was elected called the Reichstag. The Reichstag did have limited powers, but usually we associate, of course, in a parliamentary system. The prime minister is usually accountable and elected by a majority of the deputies. And of course, the legislature can typically force a prime minister from office. In the German case under the Second Reich, the chancellor, who is the prime minister, was not responsible to the legislature, but instead was limited to the Kaiser, who was a powerful chief executive. So note, however, that even though the German system was authoritarian during the Second Reich, it took a very modern view of politics. In fact, Germany becomes the first modern welfare state. The German states, because of that history of regionalism and autonomy, retained a significant amount of power. There was the formation of a modern political party. Roskin points out how the SPD, which still exists, it is the Socialist Party of Germany to this very date. In 1875, this party became the Party of Labor and the primary advocate for the industrial working class, and it is the only operating political party that predates the Second World War. And Roskin doesn't give you any percentages, but I will. You don't need to know these, obviously. But if you take a look, this party was the leading party in the Reichstag for quite some time. In 1898, the SPD won 27% of the vote. In the last election before the First World War in 1912, that vote had increased to 34.8%, so essentially 35% of the vote in Germany was socialist. Now, despite the fact that Bismarck did not like the socialists and the fact that he really didn't like political parties at all, under the Kaiser and under Bismarck, Germany initiated a medical and accident insurance. They initiated a government pension plan, state employment office. The idea of national health care. In essence, when you take a look at that list in Roskin, this is the foundations of a modern welfare state. And so even though we associate a welfare state with liberalism and with democracy, Germany developed the welfare state with an authoritarian political system. Now, I want to go back to my quibble with Roskin earlier, that box called Bismarck's dubious legacy, because even though in one sentence he acknowledges that the problem of Bismarck was that his successors were not as adept at foreign policy as him, they ignored some of his advice. I don't think Bismarck should get the blame for that. Bismarck, as I mentioned earlier, was very conservative, was very prudent. And when he was really fired, although technically you often hear the term retired. In fact, I think that's the phrase that Roskin uses. Notice that German foreign policy did the exact opposite of what Bismarck uh, was doing when he was the foreign minister. First of all, Bismarck said no large navies. That is going to antagonize the British. It's going to challenge their colonial holdings. It will drive Britain away from us. And Germany had a very friendly relationship with the British when Bismarck was their foreign minister. Instead, Kaiser Wilhelm decided that he was going to build the largest navy in the world. This touched off a huge naval arms race with Britain. Eventually, Britain had the largest navy in the world, and for a short period of time, Germany had the second largest. And sure enough, what this did was it drove Britain and France into an alliance with one another. Now, think about that. We've studied Britain, we studied France in here. The two were mortal enemies for centuries. Bismarck had France diplomatically isolated. He had a cozy relationship with the English. The English and the French did not like one another. And now what happens? Kaiser Wilhelm challenges the British Empire, the British Navy, and the British instead turn their diplomatic attention away from Germany, and they actually form an alliance with France, something that, if you know the history of Britain and France, seemed unimaginable. So, okay, so now Germany has driven the British and the French into each other's arms. Now, he also drives Russia into their arms because Germany, once again, Bismarck said that Eastern Europe is a quagmire. Do not back Austria. Austria is a sick man. In this case, they and the Russians, who also are not doing particularly well, get into a rivalry. Roskin doesn't point this out, and I don't have it in the notes, and I wasn't even going to mention it, but it just comes to mind. For Russia, for 200 years, from 1678 until 1878, over that 2 centuries, Russia had 9 wars with the Ottoman Turks. So the rivalry for Russia up until 1878 was not Europe. Their attention was not on Europe, it was the Middle East. And finally, what happened in that ninth and last war was that France invested a lot of money, a lot of resources into building a primitive by modern standards, but based on the region they were in, a fairly modern railway system in Russia. And the creation of this French, and to a lesser extent British investment in the Russian railway system, what it did was it allowed the Russians to mobilize fairly quickly against the Turks, defeat them very badly. The Russians were able to get the peace treaty, the terms that they wanted, with access to the Black Sea and a variety of other things. And with the defeat of their rivals, the Ottoman Turks, Russia now turned its attention to Eastern Europe. And so Russia and Austria developed a rivalry over an area called the Balkans. And Bismarck had said, do not get involved in this. Do not back Austria in this. If Austria and Russia get into a scrape, stay out of this. Instead, once Bismarck leaves the scene, Germany backs the Austrians against the Russians for influence in the Balkans. And this drives Russia into an alliance with both the British and the French. And so this, of course, becomes the triple entente. Britain, France, and Russia allied together. And so when World War I occurs, now what that meant for Germany was they would have to face the prospect of fighting Britain and France on the Western Front and Russia on the Eastern Front, creating a two-front war and a potential recipe for disaster. And so what created this rigid alliance system was failing to live up to the prudence that Bismarck was advocating throughout this entire period. Now, if you're wondering about this part of the Ruskin chapter where the Kaiser and in fact the leaders of all of the various countries were talking about how they expected World War I to be a very short war, perhaps only a few months. Perhaps I'll give you a little guidance as to why. Wars had been kind of shrinking. Wars are kind of an interesting thing because technology can drastically change things. And typically, countries prepare for the last war that they fought. And of course, in the intervening time, things can happen to change that. For example, for centuries, the defenders had an advantage. They could hold up in their castle, and it was very tough to storm and defeat people who were entrenched in a castle. Basically, you had to siege the capital. Yes, there were siege engines, and there were ways to attack a castle, but the defenders had a huge advantage. And then overnight, you get gunpowder, you get the introduction of cannons, and you can get an army come in with cannons, blow the hell out of the walls, and now the offense had a huge advantage. Wars had been shrinking in size and duration, and the thought was it would occur again, but it didn't. We ended up with this awful war with trench warfare. It was very bloody. The defenders once again had a huge advantage, especially with the machine guns. And the war took over 4 years. It cost over 10 million lives. And the political tragedy of World War I is that it is a war where there is a lot of blame to go around. And instead, if you look at the Versailles Treaty that signaled the end of the war, it was a recipe for a Second World War for the reasons that are mentioned in the chapter. First of all, Germany was blamed for the war, even though there were multiple reasons for the war, and even though there were miscalculations and bad diplomacy all the way around, Germany was given total blame for this war. Second, Germany was given harsh reparations, 133 billion in gold in this particular case, and Germany was not really able to pay off its debt. It was humiliated by being blamed for the war. And Germany, which had gotten in the colonial race fairly late, if you look at a country, for example, German Southwest Africa, for example, which is just to the west of South Africa. It's a country that today, if you look on the map, it's a country that is known as Namibia, for example. The capital of Namibia is a town that looks very German. If you look up Windhoek and you look at architecture of the architecture of Windhoek, it is a kind of a German-looking town because the Germans established that. The Germans were stripped of all of their overseas colonies. They also lost the Alsace and Lorraine, which remember they had taken during the Franco-Prussian War. The Polish corridor, there was we get Poland reestablished, and Germany loses quite a bit of territory there. And so at the end of this war, you get this stab in the back myth when the Nazis and Hitler and others say, well, take a look at World War I. When the war ended, did you see the French armies? Did you see the British armies? No. The war was still being fought in France. We were sold out. Well, technically, that was true. The war was still being fought in France, but the Western Front had disintegrated. And if the war had lasted a couple more weeks, the Allies would have been deeply into Germany. There was no stab in the back. The Germans were defeated. And we'll talk about the